People tell me all the time you should never wash your cast iron pan with soap and water. The reality is that sometimes things are really dirty and gross and you should wash them out with soap and water. So if you want to season your cast iron pan, that's a question we get a lot. Like, I've got this cast iron pan, how do I season it? When you think about seasoning in cooking, you're often thinking about either salting or seasoning with other herbs and spices to make something taste good. When you talk about seasoning a cast iron pan, you're talking about this layer of oil and fat that's baked on and filling all of the porous holes in the cast iron, so it almost acts like a non-stick pan because it's got this slick layer that gets built up over time. So to season your cast iron pan properly, you're going to need the following tools and ingredients. Basically, you need a dry rag, and you want a rag that you really don't care about because it's going to get really dirty. You need kosher salt, and I like this kosher salt because it's got some grit and grain. We're actually going to use it almost like sandpaper to scrub out the pan. And then you need a vegetable oil or Crisco. Crisco is kind of the ideal seasoning agent. I don't happen to have Crisco, and vegetable oil also works. Don't really want to use olive oil because it kind of leaves a sticky residue. So basically, first and foremost, what you want to do is heat up your pan. You want it to get really hot. If you're seasoning your cast iron pan and it's got, you know, for the first time it's got some baked on particles or food stuff, you can actually turn the pan upside down on the burner like this, and that'll make sure that it really burns out. I mean, when we're seasoning pans in a professional kitchen and you need to go through a bunch of them, we'll put them all in the oven at 550 degrees for half an hour and then turn them upside down. And what'll happen is they'll actually carbonize any food particles that are in there. So you'll get some like thick, you know, foodstuffs that have been stuck on there forever that you really can't scrub off even with soap and water. But if you put them over, flipped over on the burner like this for 20 minutes after it's been in the oven at 550 degrees for a half an hour, they turn completely carbony, like almost to dust. And then once the pan is nice and hot, we're gonna pour in some of our kosher salt, and using our rag, you're just going to bunch it up, and really want to be careful to use a dry rag here. So when there's moisture in a rag, even if it's a little bit damp, and you put it on something that's hot, 500 or 600 degrees, the water on the bottom of the rag immediately boils and turns into vapor. That steam steams through the rag and then hits your hand on the other side. So even though you can have a really thick rag, you can burn yourself quite easily, and a steam burn is worse than even boiling water. Because even though it's 212 degrees, we all know that like water boils and it becomes steam at 212 degrees, the act of rising from 211 degrees to 212 degrees and jumping from a water state, a liquid state, to a gaseous state actually requires a huge amount of energy. And when the water condenses onto your hand, it actually releases that energy into your hand. So a steam burn is in an order of magnitude greater than a boiling water burn, even though it's only 1 degree hotter. Want to talk more about the physics of that, you can tune into some other podcast. So we've got our hot pan, we've poured in our salt, and we're just going to kind of rub the salt around the pan. And we're rubbing in this particular case, I love my cast iron pan. This is an expensive fancy pan. It was a gift from my big brother, so I take great care of it. So there aren't any real big food particles on here that I'm nervous about trying to like rub off. But if there are, I mean, you could really scrub just like you would scrub with a metal, you know, or a sponge underwater. And you're going to really kind of like scrub around. Basically, the salt is soft enough that it's not going to scratch the steel and create any further divots that any, you know, food particles are going to fit into and make it less kind of like non-stick. But it's rough enough that it will actually get all of the grit off of there. So once I've kind of rubbed my entire pan and cleaned it with the salt, what I want to do is just over the sink, we're just going to literally dump it out, and using our, oh, hot. You can hear the salt actually sizzling when it hits the wet sink because it's so hot. But once that's the case, I'm going to put it back on the fire, can fold out the salty part of my rag here, and we're going to put a little bit of, ideally the Crisco, but in this case we've got this vegetable oil, just a little bit of the oil in the hot pan, and then I'm going to rub it around the entire pan, and my goal is that I want to give a nice coating to the entire pan of the oil, and then I can kind of just turn it off. Because it's a hot pan, any water or any moisture will be cooked off, and the oil is going to completely coat and soak into my clean pan and create a really thin, fine layer of oil that will stop it from rusting, because cast iron is not stainless steel. It'll rust if it's put away wet. It'll stop it from rusting, and it'll also bake on and absorb into the porous steel and create that fine layer that is a properly seasoned cast iron pan, which will almost act like a non-stick. And a cast iron pan like this, you know, you can get it screaming hot. So the good thing about a cast iron pan is you can put it over an open flame until it's almost red hot. If you did that with a stainless steel pan, it'll buckle. They're just not meant to have that level of heat. Also, because they're really heavy, it retains all of that heat. That steel, once it heats up, takes a long time. So even if this is off for 5 minutes, it'll still be really hot. So when I'm cooking something like a thick steak, I want to get a nice crust on it, you can imagine that a cold steak takes a lot of heat out of the pan. So a thin piece of stainless steel, even if it's really hot, I put that hot steak on it, kind of immediately cools down and starts to steam the steak, and it doesn't get that really beautiful thick crust that I like. Whereas a cast iron pan, once you heat it up, you can pretty much fry in there for a long time. So now that we've properly seasoned our pan, I'm going to leave it on the stove and let it cool down. It's going to be quite hot for a good 10 or 20 minutes. And once it's cooled down, we can put it away. That's the proper way to season a cast iron pan. Be sure to like and subscribe, check us on Instagram, and download the Project Foodie app on the iOS App Store.